Welcome to another broadcast from mindsyourhealthcast.com. Now, I'm sure of those of you who have been anxiously following all of my episodes. You probably were wondering what I was going to follow up the last two broadcasts with, which had to do with energy and information and life. A rather complex subject. It entailed a tremendous amount. I had enough material for probably 5 to 10 times the amount of time that we talked, so I could just touch on some tidbits, hopefully enough to catch your attention and interest you to the point that you would go and look into it on your own and find out more about it. Now, I realize it's complex and difficult in many ways because we're talking about concepts that run not counter to, but beyond the traditional medical model that has been established. Now, many, many years ago, in fact, a few centuries ago, there was a consensus between the church and science that the science would go with the body and the mechanical side of man, and that the church would go with the spiritual, psychological, emotional side. And so, by some consensus agreement, they split in two different directions. Consequently, the medical model that came out of this scientific split continued on to the point that man basically is nothing but a machine, and that the pieces are interchangeable, and that they wear out and can be replaced, and that things get in and attack us, and we have to have more powerful weapons to shoot these things out that attack us. And it created a whole approach to medicine. So surgery became big. We couldn't really help the person get well in many cases, so we had to wait till a tumor developed, or a injury, or a organ deteriorated to the point that we had to cut it out and replace it, or we had to cut an organ which we considered not essential, therefore no problem to take it out. If you can live without it, then you don't really need it. And so that model has prevailed and still does to a great degree, even though modern physics, quantum physics, came along and showed that things aren't the way everybody has thought they are. But unfortunately, medicine has not caught up with that yet. So we still have had that split. Now, counter to that is another group who have looked at man as a much broader being, having something that we call mind, that has been a real bug to the mechanistic approach, who said, well, mind is nothing but an artifact of neurological function in the brain, and yet when you take a chunk of the brain out, the mind can still function. You should have lost it, a lot of your function, if you took it out. And I've known of cases where a whole half of the brain was removed and the person was able to function, and you wouldn't realize that they had ever had a problem. So that there's chinks in it, but medicine has failed to, of course, acknowledge that. They just kind of ignore that. And placebo has been a pain in their butt, so to speak, because actually placebo is so strong that it can create or dissolve tumors. It can run counter to a powerful drug. In other words, if you were given a powerful drug to sedate you and told that it was a powerful amphetamine, many of the people in that type of study actually became hyper with having taken a powerful sedative because they believed they were taking a powerful amphetamine, so it actually overrode the effect of the drug on their system. So that's a part that medicine kind of likes to ignore, and still does, but we want to go deeper than that, because we don't. What I'm presenting is, it has to do with health and sickness, but we want to go beyond that, because we want to understand, how does it all work? What's really going on? And if we get a better handle on what's going on, then we can design better ways to keep ourselves healthy and to live a long, healthy life. That has been a concern of the people who have thought of man as being something greater and more than just this little box of pieces. Now, the last two, as I say, presentations had to do with energy and information, and so we gave you a few little tidbits, but as I say, I had a preponderance of material that there was just no way I could even introduce some, because if I did, then I could have taken the whole broadcast on one aspect of it. But I wanted to give you enough to kind of give you a general picture that the way things work has to do with energy, and it has to do with information. And when you change information, you change the way the energy behaves. And therefore, it becomes important to understand that if you really want to be healthy, because where does the information come from? In relation to our body, a high percentage of the information we're dealing with is coming from our own processes, our own thoughts. Unfortunately, a high level of them unconscious. There's been different numbers, anywhere from 95 to 97% of the brain activity that's going on is in our conscious awareness. All the rest of it is running in the background. It's kind of like a computer, you know. You can bring up a window and be doing something with that window, but at the same time there can be half a dozen or a dozen other programs running in the background, and some of them very active. A long time ago, I participated in the SETI project, which was a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and they had these big radio telescopes pointed out into different sections of space and recording signals that were coming in from space, and they had developed a program that could sort those signals and look for patterns that would be indicative of some type of intelligent information. So to do that project would have taken a computer like you wouldn't believe. I mean, a massive, massive computer. And so in order to be able to carry this off, they enlisted the help of people around the world, and especially in this country, because it was coming out, if I believe I'm correct, out of California. The people in this country, there were a lot of people participating, so what you could do is you would download a program into your computer, which was a crunching program, and then they would send you a block of data that had come in from a period of time from the radio telescopes, and then your computer would sit and crunch these numbers and try to look for patterns. And when it had gone through that whole chunk of data, it would send it back to the SETI project, and then they would give you a new one. And what was happening is, instead of having to try to design some supercomputer, which would have been massive in price and size, by enlisting all these people with their computers around the country, they in essence created a massive computer carrying on numerous tasks at one time, all crunching huge amounts of information. And it was, as I say, the patterns they were looking for. Now, they had stopped it for a while, and I'm not sure if it's been reinitiated or not. The bad thing was that if you were using your computer a lot, and especially if you were doing any complex programs, a lot of the memory and function of the computer was being eaten up by this program in the background. But it nonetheless was running the whole time if you had it in your computer. And so that our mind is like that. The unconscious part has got all these programs running that's controlling our blood pressure, our temperature, our digestion, our energy distribution in the body, our immune system, our tearing down and rebuilding, our converting of nutrients from one type to another, the making of energy, the use of energy, the storage of energy, etc. All these things that are going on in the background constantly, and we're not aware of them. But they all involve information, because it takes information to tell what each cell should be doing and what each part of each cell should be doing. And we don't have to consciously think, well, I have to make sure that my mitochondria are pumping out a lot of ATP because I'm going to be going to do an exercise program, or I'm going for a long walk, or I'm going to run a marathon. So I have to be sure that I have all the reserves available for that. And so I better get in and kind of conduct the orchestra of all the mitochondria in the body to be pumping up a lot of energy. So that we don't have to do. Our body, controlled by our informational processes, make that happen. So what I'm saying is the information becomes very important, and therefore we need to think more about what is information and what does it do. Now, last time we mentioned, we didn't get into a lot of detail, but information comes from the word to inform, which means form in, or to generate a form of something. And so when we provide the right information to the computer, for example, from a computer program, it can carry on functions. It can calculate mathematical formulas, and it can do all kinds of things. It can generate graphics, you name it, but it takes some type of information to direct what's going to happen. So basically, if you want to think of information as anything, you think of it as a pattern or direction on how something should take place. Now, I'm giving you all this because we want to take what I said the last two times and show that there's some actual applications to it in terms of what we do. Now, my clinical work over the years has been under the general auspices of what you would call energetic medicine, and in particular German energetic medicine. Now, behind that, however, it all has to do with information. And the information becomes important in terms of not only knowing what's happening, but knowing what you're going to do to help the body correct. Now, in energetic medicine, you don't force the body to do anything. You actually aid it in the direction it's going. Now, I think that's the hardest thing for people who are trained in traditional medicine and the general public in a way, because of the fact that they've been influenced by general medicine and by the ads that they put out. They lead you to believe if you take this chemical and it's in your body, it's going to do some powerfully good thing, and therefore we're going to be well, or we're going to keep from getting worse. The fact is, of course, that they do provide information, but the information that these drugs provide, you end up blocking or inhibiting some process, or in some cases overstimulating processes. In either case, working counter to what the body is doing. In other words, if you want to think of regular medicine as anything, think of it as something that controls, inhibits, or restricts your body from doing what it's trying to do, and therefore is an opposite. Whereas the basic concept principle of homeopathic medicine, as an example, then, is that you want to find out what the body's doing, and you want to add more informed energy with the same information that it's trying to accomplish. In other words, the body's trying to do something. You're going to give it a jumper, in a sense, that takes it faster and more powerfully in the direction it wants to go. So you're not running counter to the body, you're not trying to shut anything down, you're not trying to manage symptoms, you're trying to move it along. But you do it by giving it the right information that is necessary to add to what it's already doing. Now that is kind of the general thing about it. Now, how does it do that? See, this is where science has their big problem. And I wouldn't say maybe it's science, maybe it's scientism, or the religion of science, because as it seems in any field, I don't care what it is, you have people who are reasonably objective, meaning they're open to new information, which can make change by expanding the way they look at things, or you can make it a religion and set in a set of boundaries or restrictions and try to force everyone to believe the way you believe. And I dare say I don't think there is such a thing as a totally objective scientist. They have their own prejudices, consciously or unconsciously, and their own fears, and et cetera, et cetera. And some of them have a tremendous ego issue, and they are afraid to deviate. And so to me, the irony of it is true science has to do with coming to without any pre-judgment about what you can and can't do, what you can and can't find, what could be the explanation. In other words, you observe something and you just collect data about what you're observing. You don't have any prejudice that says, well, I don't like that data because that kind of leans toward this, which I think is no good or wrong or is ridiculous, and therefore we'll just kind of ignore that, and we're just going to look for the things that confirm what it is that we already want to find. And so, more often than not, that's the case. And there are so many variables that most scientific experiments, as they are so-called today, most of them leave out a lot of the variables. So they're going to get a what I call slanted picture, and it's not going to be very accurate. Okay, so now behind all of this thing with information, it has a lot to do with mathematics. Mathematics, and we're not going to get you into trying to become a mathematician if you're not one, but if you'd like to be one, I think it's probably an interesting and worthwhile pursuit. There's a mathematical thing about all of it, and that is that all these things that happen that we observe follow certain principles, and those principles sometimes they're called laws, but I prefer to think of them as principles. Not that this couldn't possibly be changed, but in general this tends to be the way things go, and so I would say it's a principle. And so mathematics is a language that can express a lot of principles that otherwise would be very difficult to handle and work with. And so a long time ago, a lot of very astute people realized that things occur or take place according to certain mathematical principles. They could be expressed in a mathematical formula. For example, the relationship of the diameter of a circle to the circumference of a circle. It's would be difficult to measure sometimes around a circle, or at least very inconvenient. But if you could measure the diameter, which is a straight line, or even the radius, which is half the distance across the circle, and take that piece of information and a standard that has been arrived at again by mathematicians called pi, which is non-variable, then the circumference becomes a function of the radius or diameter. So it's easy to calculate the circumference around the circle instead of having to try to have a long enough yardstick or measuring tape to go around this big circle and measure the circumference. So it was found early that this standard or fixed factor times something else would give you the diameter without having to measure it. And when they actually did measure, they found that it held true. So that's the way these things were arrived at. And so pretty much everything, nature is built on mathematics. If you're going to build a landscape in nature, it takes a very simple mathematical formula, and if you put it into a computer, it'll go through a series of what's called iterations and create a fractal image of the landscape. Now what that means is that there's a very minute little form that keeps repeating over and over and over and become bigger and bigger until you generate a landscape, a mountain scene, the ocean. Making difference what it is, it can be reduced down to a very small little mathematical equation or formula that will, when it runs over and over and over, will generate big landscapes. And this became very important in science fiction movies when they wanted to create some of these special landscapes. They could do it by use of fractals. Now, that's called fractal mathematics, and you can do it on your own computer. There used to be some programs, I had some out, that you could throw in a different formula and you could create all these scenes and or graphics by iterations of the same formula over and over and over and over, and it would create this big pattern. Now there's some very pretty things that come out of that. A mathematician by the name of Mandelbrot developed a whole way of looking at things based on these fractals and these very, very small equations that in iteration could create these very, very pretty forms. And so you see these very detailed, intricate forms, and especially when they, excuse me, when they do it in color, it comes out very pretty. Well, it appears things in nature are built that way. They're built by these little mathematical expressions. Now, so these constants, which is what we're talking about with the circle, for example, those constants are in nature and the reality as we experience it of the universe. And if you learn those constants, it's interesting what you can do with those. And a lot of people have spent their whole life studying this type of thing and arriving at these constants and formulas to utilize them and to give you pieces of information about reality as we experience it. So the mathematical part is very important, and it's kind of like a code. And here's the code that will generate a particular thing. So if you wanted to grow a particular flower, there would be a code that would generate that flower. Now, one of the ways you can store the code is in DNA and RNA. And that can be a code. And then there's another factor, and that is called resonance. That's important. And we hadn't talked really too much about that in the last broadcast of what resonance is. I'm sure you have a general idea, and some may have seen they had some commercials on TV before when this singer would hit a certain note and maintain that note for a little while, and a glass sitting there would start to vibrate and would almost explode. It would fall apart. And what was happening is that resonance was adding energy to the bonds between the molecules so powerfully that they actually were over-energized and they fell apart. And they broke the bonds. So everything, of course, is held together by bonds, and it's interesting in nature that when you get down to the core of it all, you take one little speck of informed energy, which we call a proton, and we take another tiny speck of informed energy, we call an electron, and in their vicinity, the electron spins around, or at least creates a cloud of probability around the nucleus, depending on how much you know about quantum physics. But as we picture it, we picture this little body called the proton in the nucleus, and we picture this little body called an electron circling around like a planet as we experience it, circling around the sun, and that is called hydrogen. Now, hydrogen has a gaseous nature, and if it comes near fire, it is explosive. Now, interestingly, if you take another one of these protons and put it in the nucleus, and you add another electron in that same orbital but on the opposite side, you now have two protons, two electrons, and what do you have? You have helium. Now, helium is also a gas, but it won't burn at all. In fact, helium will put out a fire. So here you have just a slight difference in the arrangement of the same thing, which are protons and electrons. And what do you have? You have one is a gas that is light and very explosive, and the second is a gas that's a little bit heavier, but non-explosive. In fact, will not support a flame at all, or fire. And so as you keep adding protons and then eventually neutrons come into the picture, and more electrons, you go up the ladder and they become, instead of a gas, they become a solid. And sometimes a very unstable solid that oxidizes easily, like phosphorus or sodium. Or as you go on up, you get some gases that are called noble gases that will not interact with things in general at all. You can't build anything out of, you can't build a molecule out of them. Hydrogen, you can build molecules from, because if you take two atoms of hydrogen and add it to an atom of oxygen, now you have water. So our whole universe is built from information informing energy to appear and behave in certain ways. Now, I'm giving you all this because I'm laying a foundation, because we're going to talk about a type of understanding of the body and the mind, and a therapy related to that that probably most of you have never even heard of. In all the talk about energy medicine, you've not heard of it. And so it looks like from the timing that this is going to be at least a 2-session program. I was asked, is it going to be, but it appears it is. Now, the program is called just simply the SAF system. That's what we're really getting into. That would be the name of this today. So this is part 1 of the SAF system. But in order to have some understanding of that, you needed to have a little bit of background. Now, if you want to read in advance the same book that I have mentioned several times, The Basic Code of the Universe, The Science of the Invisible, and Physics, Medicine, and Spirituality, by Massimo Citro, MD, from Italy. And one of my other favorite authors wrote the foreword, Dr. Irvin Laszlo, who is a very interesting individual, written several books of which you might find very interesting if you were to read them. So that one is going to be a good one to review if you haven't, or get it and start reading it if you don't have it yet. And another one I thought was interesting from a bigger understanding side, written by another one of my favorite authors and physicists, Fred Alan Wolf. It's called Mind into Matter, A New Alchemy of Science and Spirit. He quotes in this book an interesting comment which was made by another scientist by the name of Heinz Pagels, or Pagels, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who was a physicist. And I have the book. It was called The Cosmic Code. And he said, I think the universe is a message written in a code, a cosmic code, and the scientist's job is to decipher that code, which is pretty true. It is written in a code. And I've mentioned the work of Rupert Sheldrake, which would be another extremely good book. I've mentioned it back along the way. You probably don't recall. I've thrown out so many books that sometimes it's hard to keep them sorted. But he wrote a book many years ago that now here's a man with impeccable credentials from Cambridge in England, a scientist in his own right, and he, after years of wrestling with certain issues, came out with a book called A New Science of Life. Now, I hadn't heard about it. Of course, it got no press, as a lot of the really good books don't get press because they inform you too much. I think. This book, I found out about it because there was a press interview of a small group of I'm not sure if they were scientists or they were scientismists. But anyhow, that's what I suspect they were. They held this book up and they said, this book is a candidate for a book burning. And as soon as I heard that, I knew immediately it was a book I needed to read. And so in A New Science of Life, he introduces a type of information that you will find exciting and very useful, but there's no time to get into it today. But the next time we'll talk a bit about it, because it all is part of how this whole thing comes together and will make sense when we start to talk about this type of understanding of a person and their health history and their emotional history and how it can be deciphered and how something can be done to improve it, called the SAF system. I don't want to give you too much, and I don't want you running way ahead and before you have some of the basics that you ought to know about it. But I think you will find it fascinating. It's not brand new, but because of the untimely death of the originator of the system, it kind of got put on the back shelf for many years, but now it's back out. And it again, going to take a long time before I'm sure it catches on. I was working with it before and quit working with it because of the death of the researcher and originator of the system. And I was happy to find that it had been resurrected, so to speak, or brought back off the shelf. And I think you'll find it fascinating what you can do with it. It was nice being with you again. We've kind of expired our time, as usual. But I want to remind you that this Mind into Matter is going to be a good book, The Basic Code, and of course some of the others that I've talked about before, because we have to talk a little bit about something called intention yet. We've talked about it some, but we need to talk about it more in this whole process, as well as resonance. We want to talk a little bit more about what resonance is and how it fits in with what we're talking about. So it was nice being with you. Be sure and go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and also to go clicking from that, because we have a connection there, a link to alternative health and prevention, and see what's happening. I'm thinking about putting a page on SAF on our website to give you some information about it, but it's very fascinating. And knowing a little bit about mathematics, a little bit about some of the other things we just mentioned, will help it make more sense to you. It was nice to be with you again, and we look forward to seeing you for our next visit from mindyourhealthcast.com. In the meantime, be healthy.